what I would like to do is give some sense of a kind of, theological foundation for thinking about Jewish-Christian alliance, uh, and within the context of the kind of political things that we're talking about here. One of the things that we have in common is the golden rule, not to do to others what you don't want them to do to you. But I'm going to violate that right now by reading my piece rather than just speaking. I hate having that done to me, but I'm going to do it to you. So here we go. At the end of classical antiquity, it was Augustine who discerned most clearly antiquity's fundamental flaw. Philosophers, from the distance, taken by the objectifying dialectic of philosophy itself, had pointed toward something like true happiness, the lofty goal of man, but were unable to traverse the distance to it. For those philosophers, this was because of nature itself and human embodiment. The philosophers' abstracted, objective idea of human happiness or perfection was a methodological correlate to their notion of formless and hopelessly recalcitrant matter. Likewise, the objective idea of the one, in subordination to which all things find their essential and eternal perfection, excludes from that perfection their imperfect individual existence. But as Augustine understood so well, human persons exist. They live in passing time and changing place. The satisfaction of the restless longing of Augustine's own heart could not be achieved philosophically. The existing philosopher himself, as Augustine presents him, aging, bent over, doddering, had to learn resignation. And everybody else, as Plato had presented the matter, had to be fed noble lies, consoling illusions of various sorts, political and religious, in the near universal practice that the scriptures call idolatry. This could generate sufficient virtue not to achieve happiness, but perhaps enough to get by and keep people in order. For the ancients, the desire for happiness is frustrated by nature as a sort of metaphysical necessity. For Augustine, however, if man cannot traverse the distance to his highest happiness on the basis of his natural powers, it's not because of a metaphysical necessity, but because of a kind of endemic personal lapse. The untraversable distance facing man is the consequence of man's own subjective brokenness. Or to put it another way, objective thought cannot bring man to his happiness because happiness does not consist in the apprehension or possession of any object. A man himself is a subject, not a materially individuated idea, and as such he is a being of a higher order altogether than any object. Happiness does not consist in an apprehension or possession of an object, but consists rather in mutual relationships with other subjects, including most especially the highest subject as he has revealed himself, the personal God, creator of existing men and women. If man has broken this relationship, its repair cannot possibly stand in man's power alone. Thus Augustine's beef with the Pelagians. The other party must also consent and must make the repair possible by a free act of forgiveness. And given the disproportion between the two parties involved here, man and God, God's forgiveness is in no way owed, but is given only by sovereign, divine, and astonishing freedom. But such precisely is the God who astonished, for example, the once objectifying and philosophic young Moses. He had been a sort of Harvard-educated guy who, at the burning bush, thought he must turn aside to see this sight, the cause that the bush is not consumed. But he encountered instead the God who knew him by name, Moses, and who unsettled the firmness of Moses' objectifying foothold. Take off your shoes. And thus revealed himself as the God who freely initiates on his own, with Moses, the liberating redemption of Israel from Egypt and its idolatry. Augustine thus came to see that his happiness could be attained only when he turned to see the God who had already turned toward him and knew him by name. Augustine's happiness depended on what he calls God's grace, that is, God's gratuitous and creative willingness to initiate and enter into relationship with human beings. The scriptures, both Hebrew and Christian, find this grace in the free and faithful covenantal will of God. It's here, in covenantal relation, that existing, living, personal human beings find their perfection or happiness, or as the Christian tradition puts it, their salvation. Life in the covenant is the matrix of true virtue. Augustine understood these matters perhaps better than anyone else, and so raised his biblical critique of hopeless classical antiquity, and along the way laid foundations for what would become Christendom. Nevertheless, Christendom, a political order and not merely an eschatological city of God, incorporated into itself much of the vision of the old order, including especially the habits born of philosophy's objectifying flaw. Politics is, after all, necessarily about power, and the achievement of power is the proper work of objectifying reason, imposing form onto matter. Philosophy and political thinking inhabit the same neighborhood, or at least adjoining neighborhoods. The achievements of Christendom were extraordinary, I think. Its covenantal wisdom manifested both the heights of human dignity and its universality. It cultivated human virtue and acknowledged the divine imperative to human freedom. It practiced what Catholics call the principle of subsidiarity, allowing for a bewildering diversity of particular peoples, nations, and social organizations to share its universal vision. But still we can say that the political order of Christendom, like that of classical antiquity, did not achieve happiness. The Jews there, precisely because of faithfulness to their covenant, were enclosed within the walls of Christian contempt and shut out from the authoritative center of Christendom. They bore particular witness to the fact that the fundamental flaw of antiquity had inserted itself into Christendom. Its power was at odds with their freedom. Christendom's reliance on the objectifying methods of classical philosophy, even in its theologizing, had been quite naturally co-opted by those whose interest was power. So, at the end of Christendom, as at the end of classical antiquity, another great critic, Machiavelli, arose who, like Augustine, unmasked the pretensions of the prevailing political order and what he called its imaginary and imprudent ideals, never considering the possibility of a real happiness founded in a covenant with a God who elects a people, and rejecting the classical vision of the truth and happiness that might be loved but never achieved. Machiavelli set out to articulate instead the effectual truth, the truth aimed at goals within the grasp of objective human thought and power. Seeing himself as a new Moses, he founded a political science that would later, in the work of his successors, yield a new natural science to vex nature itself and abolish its frustrating limitations. Perhaps here, too, happiness might not be attained, but progress toward it, rather than helpless resignation, could seem a reasonable enough goal, especially as Christendom fractured and collapsed. Salvation here, in Machiavelli's modernity, stands not as divine fulfillment of a covenantal promise to faithful men, but as a matter of right, to be claimed by those who, liberated from the strictures of faithfulness, assert human power by their progressively unbounded objectification of the world, human and natural both. This means the end of the old-time religion. But if modernity aims at a non-Christian order, it never for an instant escapes the political inevitability of religious conviction. Modernity would co-opt the moral and religious heritage of Christianity to serve its own new political agenda. Virtuous habits linked to the old common good lent cohesion to the otherwise centrifugal forces of the new politics. After Protestantism had shifted the institutional center of religious authority from the Catholic hierarchy to the spirit-founded freedom of the individual Christian and his rights, those rights would then supersede revealed scriptural authority altogether. Then the people, formerly the people of God, would elect to hoist up the state that would secure their rights and so merit effectual reverence in the absence of the covenantal God whom they themselves had replaced. Rights, not an inherent common good, not covenantal fidelity, not virtue, become the standard of righteousness and the locus of religious passion. And an essentially vacuous democratic process stands in for the creed. The assertion of rights in democratic process does not, however, generate virtue. Rather, the abandonment of the covenantal center of the West entails forgetfulness of the revealed sources of virtue, rooted in the covenantal vision of human dignity, of the divine imperative to freedom, and of the wise old wariness of the depravity of human beings. A sufficient residue of just such things is necessary, however, for a minimal functioning even of the democratic process. Their absence makes for our crisis. The covenantal center no longer holds. In its place, the political dynamism of the West spirals out in a widening gyre in those mutually repelling forces, left and right, which the covenantal heritage had held together. On the right, there was a residue of the old reverence for authority and of recognition of the human penchant for depravity, and thus of the need for limits to governmental power and extent, and for well-rooted tradition, law and order, and preparedness for war. One might say the right was in the place of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, our fathers. On the left, in the place of the God who will be who he will be, there was the lofty potential of man, now billed as the perfectibility of human nature, and the boundless expansion of human freedom and its correlate ceaseless progress in the acquisition of human power over nature generally and over human nature most especially. As the Christian or biblical wellspring dries up, right and left represent increasingly opposed and merely self-interested factions, one tending toward fascistic self-assertion and the other toward the tyranny of global systems. Each grows increasingly irreconcilable with the other as they forget all they once held in common. The religious passion of the democracies of the West divides into forces straining away from each other across a Gnostic abyss. The order, once sustained in part by virtue's inward cohesion to the common good, becomes order imposed from without by the absolutely objectivizing power we call totalitarianism. Meanwhile, more ancient enemies look on with attentive interest. The attempt to co-opt scriptural and classical wisdom for the sake of preserving liberal democracy is, to my mind, a failed project. The resulting crisis is theological. It requires a theological critique. That is, an intellectually serious, biblically founded critique of modernity. So what is there for the West? It had its origins in the old wisdom which generated virtue, but if, as was clear to Augustine already at the beginnings of Christendom, the classical philosophic tradition was essentially flawed, then even if that tradition may still be important to us and useful, still, to revitalize the West, what is required is a new return to the scriptural tradition, where objectifying philosophical thought is true handmaiden, as Catholics used to say, to covenantal thought and practice, and not its secret pedagogue. This is for the West the one true hope, I think, our staff of Moses. It has always been so, but now our backs are against the sea, and Pharaoh's armies come to carry us into slavery again. We have to stretch out that staff and do a kind of thinking we have not done very much of. I'm struggling to get at what precisely distinguishes biblical or covenantal thought from philosophy or science, ancient and modern. The objective knowledge sought by philosophy and science aims at a sort of mastery, theoretical and also sometimes practical. A mastery achieved once one has grasped the ultimate and necessary causes or principles that constitute the whole under investigation. The various wholes to be known are the objects of the various sciences, as Aristotle calls them. And the highest of the sciences embraces the whole of the wholes. It's what Aristotle calls metaphysics. Nature and its various parts, likewise politics, even perhaps history itself, some would assert, can be regarded as knowable in this way. Both aim at what we might call a secure foothold in the midst of the necessary structure of things. Both regard necessity as the primary attribute of knowable being. In politics, this foothold assumes two possible forms: submission to some necessary universal order on the one hand, and on the other, assertion of one's own particular order off against the rest. The consequence is history as the endless rehearsal of fratricidal violence, necessarily. But the scriptures propose a way of thinking that rejects this supposed necessity and overcomes the opposition between the universal and the particular. In the scriptures, God says, "Let it be." The world is not necessary, but comes to be by way of a divine command or even a divine permission. In any case, it comes to be as a response to a creative act undertaken in the absence of any necessity whatever. To exist is to stand in response, that is, in relation to another. And for man, the image and likeness of such a creator, this is most perfectly the case. The man exists in relation to God and to the woman. And so long as neither the man nor the woman seeks the knowledge that would provide the necessary foothold for power off against the other, or God, they are happy, and it is well with them and with God. God himself does not stand as necessary, but rather as he who will be who he will be. The Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, identifies both this freedom of God in himself and the letting be, Yehi, of his creative act. Moreover, the God who will be who he will be the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is who he will be. This is my name forever, he says. The creative logos is self-consistent and intelligible even as it is free, not necessary, and as it bears on the particular. If the nations are all defined either by their claims to universal power or by their particular assertions of power against the rest, Israel stands on new ground, holy ground, where particularity and universality possess no foothold and impose no power one against the other. Israel is to fight against Amalek that would annihilate it, but it is to stand apart from the nations and exercise no empire. Its first home is alone in the desert, in all its particularity assembled around the Mishkan and wandering freely in the presence of God. And still, after the time in the desert, it does not impose a necessary universal order on all the nations, but wanders among them, priestly among them, and a source of God's promised blessing for them universally. The covenantal order of Christendom, at its truest, likewise overcame the opposition between particular and universal claims. Without submitting to a necessary whole, many nations could stand together in a single covenant. It was the misuse of covenantal claims by kings and popes, however, to reassert the old Roman urge toward empire that meant the collapse of Christendom and the rise of Machiavelli's modernity, aiming unabashedly at power and living off the waning moral cohesiveness of the covenant, but necessarily dividing again between universal and particular, now as left and right, globalist and fascist. The conservatism we seek here finds no place on the tense continuum left and right. What is to be conserved ultimately is the covenant. What is to be kept is the faith. If the political order is to be revived in some sense, the sources of virtue in the covenant aren't to be co-opted, but on the contrary, those sources must stand in prophetic critique of every reduction of human beings to matters of mere political power. There is, for us, yes, a preference for the particular nations rather than some universal empire, for the scattering of peoples and languages rather than the monolithic slavery of Babylon. But what defines the action of the people of God among the nations is not their engagement in the political process, even though most of them perhaps should be so engaged. What defines the action of the people of God is the critique, the prophetic critique they offer from their covenantal standpoint. Engagement with the political process runs the risk, faces even the strong likelihood of co-optation by it. That's what the process is designed, after all, to do. Radical critique, on the other hand, repels co-optation and exposes the totalitarian threat. Prophetic critique is prior to and more effective than political engagement. Maybe in the end it's more dangerous. One final point. The early Christians too much attempted to co-opt and supersede Judaism. They wanted to be Veris Israel. And Christendom too much co-opted Christianity and treated the covenant as a source of Roman political cohesion, and thus excluded the Jews who lived among them and had kept their covenantal faith. The bad relations between Christians and Jews in Christendom had its chief source, I think, in Christendom's violation of the Christian covenant in its taking God's name in vain. The moderns capitalized enormously on this flaw, co-opted a discredited Christendom, and built an order based on power alone, and then sought to annihilate the Jews. For us, an effective prophetic stance on the part of the people of God facing the totalitarian drift of the modern world requires that Christians and Jews get undeceived and unco-opted, stand faithful to their two covenants with God, and discover the covenantal bond they share with each other. Bound together in letting each other be, they would become the visible presence of God in the world, the Anointed One, and our regenerative and messianic hope.